Greetings from Tokyo. This is Daisuke Beppu. How are you doing today? What I'd like to do, if you don't mind, is I'd like to take a few moments of your time, if I may, to talk to you about a very special work. Woman in the Dunes. As part of the great series on YouTube called BOOK2FILM by my dear friend Adam at the channel mementomori, I would like to give a few comments, if I may, about the film Woman in the Dunes. Now, Adam has very generously and very kindly allowed me to provide some comments about this work, and so if you don't mind, I'd like to do so right now. I will talk about certain details of this work, so if you haven't seen it yet, or if you don't know the story, if you haven't read the story, and if you are wary of listening to spoilers, then I suggest that you stop this video and read the book or watch the film, or perhaps both, and then you can come back to this video at any time. There's no hurry, there's no rush at all, there's no need to rush, so please take your time, and when you come back, I'll be more than happy to talk to you and discuss this work with you. So, where to begin with this very memorable story? I remember reading the book when I was quite young, actually, because my father was a great admirer of the works of Kobo Abe, and so I was perhaps influenced by his admiration for his works. So I read a number of Kobo Abe's books, and I must admit I was a bit too young, I think, to appreciate them fully. But much later, when I was out of college, I decided to visit them again. And amongst the works that I visited was, in fact, the novel, The Woman in the Dunes. And I find it to be at once a strange tale and at the same time a simple and straightforward tale. And so what do I mean by that? I suppose I mean that on the one hand it tells this very odd tale about a man who is kept against his will, apparently, in this hut with a woman, and he's unable to escape, and the town in which this house is located, this mysterious house is located in the middle of this sand, desert-like environment. The town will not allow him to escape. In fact, the town is enabling the situation that he is in, namely that they are, in essence, responsible for not allowing him to escape. Now, this man is a very interesting man because he is a very solitary man, somewhat of a loner, a little bit of an eccentric perhaps, and he is interested in discovering new insects. So, therefore, the story is about this man, and he is trapped in this situation, and he's trying to get out. So, on the basis, it sounds like a very odd story indeed, not a very conventional one, but just looking at it in terms of relationships and the development of human relationships, the story is, right? It's essentially a story about how a man who is, by his very character and nature, solitary and a bit perhaps introverted, becomes a person that eventually forms an emotional bond with this woman and by extension with the town around him, so that by the end, even though he is quite able to find a way out of his predicament, he willingly decides not to. So this is quite an interesting setup, and it's an interesting story. So therefore, it seems to be quite surreal and complicated, but in fact, it seems also, at the same time, concurrently, to be a very simple tale, and simple in terms of the direct connections that are not forged or forged between human characters. And therefore, that is the backdrop for this wonderfully complex examination of the notion of identity, the notion that how we identify ourselves and how we define ourselves in terms of our existence vis-a-vis the society around us, the society writ large, but also, I think, more crucially and more fundamentally, how we define ourselves between, let's say, in terms of intimate relationships. So therefore, this is a very enticing, wonderful, and engaging work. With that in mind, we have the film, right? This is from 1964. This is the film Woman in the Dunes, and this is directed by Hiroshi Teshigahara, and this is in collaboration with the author Kobo Abe. And this forms a very interesting work indeed, vis-a-vis the novel, because what we have is the original novelist being directly involved in the creation of this film adaptation work. And already we see a number of differences, at least I do. I would say, for instance, for example, the key character, the main character, the man, who we find out is named Junpei Nikki, he starts out in the novel anyway to be one that we see in the novel anyway to be coming from the civilized society. We see him getting off the train station, and we see him getting ready and embarking on this journey that will take him to the sand environment in search of unique insects in order for him to find some kind of glory or fame in terms of the insect-finding world. So we see glimpses of the civilized world that he leaves behind as he progresses into this new and strange environment. Whereas the film, right, the film is immediately transporting us into this odd and strange world where sand is the norm. And in fact, we get that wonderful eerie close-up of what looks like an animal skull or an alien head or some kind of grotesque shape that we realize is a grain of sand. And so that already gives us this idea that we are not safe in terms of any comforting images of civilization. No, from the get-go, we are confronted with alien images, with unsettling images, with potentially scary images that evoke this weird and odd and potentially dangerous world. Another interesting choice, I think, with respect to the film, is that I think the character, the main character, he seems to be, in my view anyway, much more of an unlikable character in the film. I think this comes across very sharply when he is talking to the old man in the village for the first time. He seems a little bit dismissive. He seems incredibly rude and dismissive when he's talking to the woman who is giving him a meal and giving him shelter for the evening. So when he's talking to her, do you remember? He seems to be very dismissive, and he's rude, and he doesn't say please very much, and he's very insistent on getting some food, and so he doesn't seem to show gratitude or express his gratefulness towards the hospitality that this woman is giving to him. Granted, it's not really to his benefit, because ultimately we realize that he is trapped in this house. So he's really a victim in this, in terms of the long-term scheme. But you see what I'm getting at in terms of his characterization. He doesn't show gratitude, and therefore he seems to be a bit of a rude guest, for lack of a better term, which makes him a bit unlikable from the start, in my opinion. But I find that to be an interesting choice on the part of the director and on the part of the actor, because what that provides us, or me as the viewer, is a wonderful ability or potential for progression in terms of his character, right? Because if we start with a character that is unlikable, there's the potential for him to develop in one of two ways, right? He can either become more unlikable, or he can become likable. And I think by the end, I think there is enough substance here in this film to suggest that he indeed becomes a more likable figure, or perhaps even a noble figure, a figure who becomes one that is concerned with things other than himself. Thus, the essence of nobility comes in. So therefore, it's an interesting choice to make his character, I would say, less of a likable person than he seems to be in the source novel. The other thing that I think is quite fascinating about the film as an adaptation is its visual depiction of sand. You know, the idea of sand is a very important one as both a direct image and also has a kind of a theme in terms of, let's say, well, it can depict many things. It can depict instability. It can depict uncertainty. It can suggest futility of work. You know, you keep digging, but it just stays the same. Nothing is, it has form. Everything is formless or without hard, concrete certainty. So therefore, it becomes quite apparent that this sand is an amorphous environment that provides no, how should I put, no stability, and that becomes a great image when set in the context of the idea of the instability of one's identity. But what's so brilliant about the film is not just that it depicts this in terms of a thematic element in the context of the narrative, but it depicts it in terms of a stark visual motif. And it is so stark because we see the ruptures in the sand formations as things move. It crumbles, and we see the movement, and we notice the waves in the sand, and we see the zooms and the close-ups and the wind as it blows particles back and forth. We really see, I would say, how should I put it, the physics of sand. And when I say physics, I mean physics in a very seemingly unnatural way, in an eerie way, in a way that almost gives the sand dune environment its own character. And this is really wonderful too, because as you know, in the story, and the novel, and also in the film, we get these interesting episodes and discussions from the woman about how she views the effective nature of sand, the scientific effective nature of sand. So for example, there's a great discussion she has about how she thinks that sand has a kind of a corrosive effect, which seems to be a ludicrous thing, but it suggests a kind of a different set of rules, the laws of physics with respect to this particular sand world. And also we see her washing her dishes with the sand, so that suggests a kind of property of sand in terms of cleansing, which from my point of view doesn't seem to make sense in my own understanding of how sand works in our world. But in her world, in the world of Woman in the Dunes, perhaps there is a different set of rules of physics that are applying to this sand. It seems to suggest that this sand has certain properties or It operates in a certain way that is different and unknown to how we understand sand to work in our universe. So this is to me very interesting, and the film punctuates this very nicely in terms of how it visually depicts the sand. It's otherworldly, it's eerie, it's scary, it's foreboding. So this becomes a very striking example of how the film adaptation, for my money, seems to create a wonderful visual stimulus in the mind of the viewer in a way that I think only film can. It's something that's completely and unique to film, which is why this film adaptation is as powerful as I believe it to be. There is so much here in terms of Woman in the Dunes as a story, as a filmed story. Ultimately, it is a two-hander. It's like just a play that has two characters in it, main characters. We have the woman and the man, and it's essentially their developing relationship. It becomes one that is really interesting, right? Because it starts out with the woman in the dunes, who is in this hut or this house, and she is essentially, well, I guess she is. She seems to be tricking the man, well, I suppose there could be argument for her not to be, but she doesn't tell him directly what his fate is when he stays for the first night. So in that sense, there is a level of deception on her part with respect to his character, and he only realizes the next day what his fate is, and therefore he becomes very resistant to the idea of being held against his will. So already the film and the novel start out with a very, how should I put it, a relationship that is uneasy, imbalanced. It starts out with, let's say, one character perhaps having a psychological advantage over the other character, so the woman over the man, because she knows the situation where he is inexperienced. She is not revealing information to him that is vital to his situation and thus his existence. So she seems to be in a position of, let's say, intellectual or emotional authority, and also she seems to be in a position where she is deceiving the man in one way or another. So there is already a disconnect that exists between them. As the film and the story progress, of course, this balance tends to shift. This shifts in, I think, two ways that are very important. One, of course, being the physical way. There's the moment when the man attacks the woman and ties her up in an effort to try to escape his fate. And also there is an imbalance that occurs because now, as the film progresses, he is the one that is fooling her. He is lying to her and he's trying to be nice to her, while he is scheming in his head, right, and trying to formulate a plan to leave. The implication is that his motivation, his prime motivation, is still to escape. So therefore, on that basis, he seems to be deceiving her. He seems to be deceiving her in a very duplicitous type of way. But this is the fascinating thing. In terms of his development, or their development, as it were, there seem to be two key events that create a kind of equilibrium, shall we say, between the characters. So probably the first event would be, right, so he makes the request to the townsmen or to some members of the town to be allowed to maybe 10 minutes out of the day or 20 minutes out of the day to see the sea, because he needs it. He says he wants it in order to maintain his sanity. And the townsman, or the elder townsman, comes back and he says, we will agree to it, but we want to see you and the woman go at it. So as he says, in other words, they want to see him have sex with the woman, and they want to watch. And by this time, all these townsmen come and they gather around the edge, the precipice. And so the man is struggling because it means that he must be basically an animal, and he must perform this vile act in order to achieve this level of limited freedom, that is the ability to be able to leave this pit and go out and see the ocean or the sea, even if it's for a few minutes out of the day. And so there's this moment when he does indeed succumb and to the pressure, and he tries and he struggles with the woman, if you remember, in the very horrible and memorable scene, and he's struggling, and the woman is breaking down and shocked, and of course she is terrified at this prospect, because it is basically her being assaulted and raped in the most horrifying way, with people watching, and the two of them just debased to the level of animals that are just being toyed with by these terrible people that are watching. There is already the glimpse of what could be the man and the woman's understanding of each other, and in particular the man's understanding and view of this woman. You can see that his struggle, this inner struggle, means that he does not consider her to be just a thing or just his enemy. Then, of course, the film and the story develop further into his discovery of this way to find water in this otherwise dry and arid landscape. And when he makes this discovery, or it is during the course of his perfection of his studies or his discovery, that we find out that the woman has a very serious condition. Not only is she pregnant, but it's quite a difficult pregnancy in terms of she is in pain, and that she is in need of immediate medical attention. So the townsmen come, and they come and they try to escort her out. So this is interesting, because we already see the man expressing concern over this woman, and we realize as viewers that he is very concerned. And not only is he concerned about the woman, but he is also eager to show his invention, or not his invention, his discovery about the water to the townsmen. Of course, he doesn't do that. He says, he'll save it for another day. So this is very interesting. Not only is he shown to have some kind of feelings towards this woman, but also he feels something to these townsfolk, which is something more than just trying to show off what his discovery is. It seems to be on a very humanitarian level, the impulse to want to help and to want to give aid to this community. And of course, this feeling becomes so evident when we find out that even though he has the means to escape because of the ladder that is left hanging, he decides not to. He decides to forego his freedom, at least freedom as he understood it to be throughout most of the film. And instead, he inspects the water trap, and he does not escape. This to me is very powerful, because until very recently, I always assumed that this ending was a bleak ending. I always thought it was a very sad ending, because from my vantage point, reading the novel, I always thought it meant his subservience to the society that has hurt him and has wronged him, because it kept him there against his will, and that therefore his identity, at least in terms of how we understand it to be in the context of civilized world, disappears and floats away. And so therefore we are left with the bleak ending of him being declared or missing, never to be seen again, we assume. So I also thought that to be a bleak ending. However, looking at the film, I find it to be not such a bleak ending. I find it instead to be a very a very optimistic ending. And the reason why is because we see the interaction between the man and the woman as the woman is being carried up, and because we see the interaction between the townsfolk and the man, it seems to me that this is a situation where the man has now found his identity in the context of this environment in a way that is not only, it's not introverted, and it's not dealing particularly with himself. We're not dealing with an identity that is based solely on his ego, but we seem to find a man who has some kind of purpose in terms of doing something outside of himself. And therefore, it seems like it's a very, how should I put it, a very positive, almost Confucian outlook towards man and his relationship to his surrounding society. And in that context, I would say it is a very optimistic ending, because he was so unlikable at the beginning of the film, if you recall, and now by the end he becomes a very noble character. This film is a masterpiece, and it's a masterpiece because it provides, in my view anyway, a through line of oddness that leads to an ending which I think can be interpreted to be an optimistic one. And yet it gives us signals in terms of oral signals and visual signals that always challenge my perception and my interpretation of this film as an optimistic, or a film with an optimistic ending. This is because, for example, the music is very jarring and quite haunting, and it's never uplifting. It always is suggestive to me of something that suggests danger and menace, and something that is foreign and alien to oneself, which is the perfect metaphor for this film and its treatment of identity, and the way that the environment challenges our notion of identity. Also, the visuals, as I said before, the sand dunes and the violence, or the potential violence that those visuals evoke, I think also provide challenging stimuli with respect to challenging, or perhaps even contradicting, my viewpoint in terms of the optimism of the ending. Nevertheless, I stand by my interpretation, and therefore I find this film to be quite complex and equally as fascinating. There's that famous passage in the film, in the novel as well, but the film, it makes it really presents it really nicely, of the man, and he is mentioning all the ways, the papers in which we identify ourselves, in terms of our driver's license, our registration, our things like that, papers that otherwise define us. And the title sequence also has the stamps, the hanko, which is also an identifying marker for people in Japan. So there are these things, these objects that create our identity. And in fact, in terms of the civilized world, the man, his identity becomes wiped out through the same method, another piece of paper, which is like a judgment or a report. So we are defined in the civilized world by things that are not human, that are themselves cold and just printings on a paper, or just things that are just stamped on an official seal of some sort, which is a great contrast, really, to the progression of the main character, is it not? Because the progression of the main character arguably is one from isolation as a character to one that becomes open to this otherwise violent and foreign society that he finds himself in, this town with the weird town folk and this woman at the center of his existence. He begins, I would argue, to care for this situation, or at least feels a sense of duty to help them, which is a fascinating reversal, is it not? Because on the one hand, the civilized society where he came from was one where he was allowed to be isolated and introverted, even though his identity was provided in these outer and perhaps arguably superficial means in terms of things and papers and objects. Whereas as the film progresses, he assumes an identity that is transcendent of these things, and rather they become something that comes from within himself rather than something that is external. So this is more fuel for my interpretation that this story and this film ends on an optimistic note. So let me end there, and I will defer now to the great memento mori Adam for his insight and wonderful observations on this very intriguing and challenging work. My name is Daisuke Beppu, and I hope you have enjoyed this or you found it interesting to some degree or another. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to let me know in the comment section below. I'd be very happy to engage in discussion with you about this work. If you disagree or agree with me or otherwise, I'm very happy to talk. Anyway, my friends, I hope you are well, and please have a very nice rest of your day. Cheers.